speaking of which, I mean, it does sort of dovetail into a wider discussion, which is what I just wanted us to talk about now. It's an article that was on a site called The Free Press, which I think is American, and it's by Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who's a hugely respected campaigner and writer, Somalian born. She now lives in America. She's the wife of Niall Ferguson, and she's spoken out always about Islam and radical Islam, but both, I would add. She's written this overview of what the hell is going on, and basically people who get in touch with us all the time, they always ask the questions: what's going on, how does this happen, and who's behind it, where are we going, and everything. She gives an absolute breakdown, doesn't she? And she lays it, on the shoulders of a number of different people. What it amounts to, is it not, Amy, to start with you, is that she's talking about a revolution, right? And there are 4 stages in that revolution, and it starts with demoralization, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Then destabilization, and then we have crisis,
and then normalization.
Right?
So this comes from a former Soviet, I think he was a KGB agent and writer and thinker, Yuri Bezmenov, who outlined this.
Bezmenov.
Yeah, and she's kind of saying that this is quite true and this is what we're going through. The demoralization happens over a period of kind of 10 to 30 years, when essentially a culture or a nation are repeatedly told that made to feel that their culture isn't worthwhile, made to lose confidence in themselves, made to give up all the values and beliefs that they ordinarily would hold, and that's kind of inverted. And then after that long period of demoralization, you get a kind of a sudden burst of revolution. And that's the destabilization that she talks about, in that suddenly everything's up for grabs and nobody, anything can happen. And she was saying in this article that she feels that she has watched the West go through this kind of period of demoralization, and actually it was kind of, everybody will have a different perspective on this, but she cites the COVID pandemic in terms of the extreme authoritarian rules and lockdown alongside the Black Lives Matter protest, and then more recently this explosion of what you were talking about previously, of people suddenly announcing that they don't believe the state of Israel should exist, or being openly anti-Semitic and waving Palestine flags, and everybody some of us thinking, where has this come from? We didn't realize so many people were anti-Semitic. She cites that as kind of being the signs of that we're moving from the demoralization to the destabilization period. She's just highlighting this as a kind of a plan of what's happening. I mean, it'd be interesting to see what both of you think. I mean, I would say probably we are in that phase now, but you could also say
we are in the
destabilization phase. But you could also argue that we've gone through the crisis and maybe we're at normalization now, because there are so many things like the anti-Semitism that we're seeing that are now just go under the radar and are seen as normal. But she's very concerned, about communism and Islamism and those two things coming together.
That's right. There's basically American Marxists are basically the basis of this. Islam or Islamism, does she say?
I think she says Islam.
Yes, and then
political Islam.
Yes, and then also, our old friends, the Chinese Communist Party. Does this ring as true to you as it does?
Well, I've been saying for years that we're now in a post-revolutionary society, so it chimes in very well with exactly what I've said. And, Bezmenov, I've long spoken about it. I wrote about him in our last book as well. And he talks all about this, media, culture, education. This is all part of the long march through the institutions. You demoralize a society by focusing on their students, because that is those 25 years, that generation. And if you bombard them with enough information, he says, for example, you can tell them how wonderful communism is and bombard them with this stuff. Then if you took them to Siberia, to a gulag, and actually showed them, they wouldn't believe it, because they've been so indoctrinated. And that's what we're seeing as a result with the youth of today. And it's quite correct to call this American Marxism. And I think actually increasingly we should get away from calling things woke and use this term of American Marxism. I mean, American Marxism actually came from the Frankfurt School and from the Italian communists originally, but in its current form, it is the greatest threat to Western civilization. And, people think about Marxism as an economic model. And James Lindsay writes about this very well, spoke about this. He He referred to Marxism as being a genus, like a cat. You know, you have lions, you have tigers, you have tabby cats and letters and cheetahs. Those are all subdivisions of a cat. And same thing with Marxism. You have economic Marxism, which is the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, which is an attack on capitalism. But then you have radical feminism, which is an attack on masculinity. Then you get critical race theory, which is another form of Marxism, which is an attack on whiteness. Then you have queer theory, which is another form of Marxism, which is an attack on heterosexuality. And then you get the decolonization movement, which is an attack on the West. And you add all of that together through intersectionality, and you have the erosion of our entire civilization. And then add to that the fact that Marxists are also atheists, and of course you have the erosion of the church. So I think it's about time we did speak about it in those Marxist terms. What the left like to do is they like to say, oh, well, cultural Marxism is an anti-Semitic term. A lot of rubbish and nonsense. Nothing to do with that at all. We need to call a spade a spade.
Actually, that's the point, because we used to quite freely call it cultural Marxism. It hadn't even occurred to me that this was some kind of... but apparently it's a bit like using the term cosmopolitan. Apparently that is kind of a dog whistle for Jewish.
I drink them all the time.
Yeah, well, but I mean, this is, I think, very, very important. I think throughout the whole article, which please do read if you can. It's on the Free Press. I don't know, you can pick it up on social media. There was no paywall. But it seems to me that she has entirely got a grip of what is actually happening in America. We're talking about America, but frankly, is there anything different about it here? I can't see anything different about it here.
No, and what she outlines as well in the article is that this is something that happens kind of under the radar, that people don't realise it's happening.
Yeah.
And I think most of us feel that there's a lot of people that just don't get it. You know, that we can see something happening that a large section of the population don't see happening and are going along with and are still going along with. It's like people often use the metaphor of a frog slowly boiling in water as the heat gets turned up. They don't realise they're being boiled alive because it's so slow. But she says, you know, that this is how it's happened, that it's gradual. And at what point do we suddenly feel that we are? Do people realise that there is a serious threat? I mean, I think people are realising it more, but there are still whole there was a Tory on Newsnight recently that was just saying, "Oh, I don't get the whole culture wars. I don't think there's a problem."
Yes.
You know, and that is what we're talking about, the kind of the frog that doesn't realise that something is happening.
Well, she went a bit further, actually. She was, I think she might be standing down this time, but anyway, but she was very, very typical of that kind of Tory. She was more or less saying that it was that we, not just that there isn't a culture war, but that we could do better when we're talking about LGBTQ issues, which is code basically for saying agree with us. You know, it's a patronising way of saying it. This is a small part of it. You're quite right. You know, like for example, when I saw the outright sectarianism at the local elections, that's when I felt we've moved on. Right, we've moved on to a stage now. And Nigel, in fact, was the only politician who actually talked about sectarianism actually around that time. But you see, what are we therefore to do? I mean, we do our best with things like this. But you see, as you say, people looking for votes at the moment from us, they would just think this is the ravings of a lunatic.
I mean, people on our channel always comment and say, "Well, you chaps talk a lot. What's going to be done about it?" All we can do, all we are able to do is alert people to what's going on and try to hopefully influence in some way the discourse around all of this. And it does take something like the Reform Party to actually get a grip of this thing and, you know, use their position as a platform to let give these views greater credence and greater currency, because this is the greatest threat. You know, this is just as big a threat as the Second World War. It's a Cold War that we're fighting. And if more people don't wake up to it, well, then, you know, it may well soon be too late.
Yes, I think the thing is, when you have like that poll about the young people thinking Israel shouldn't exist, I was sort of immediately thought, what else is coming down the line?
Yeah, how can it get,
you know?
What's next?
I mean, we've had the D-Day thing. But you can sort of, not to diminish that, but you can sort of still use our frames of reference to describe why that might be. But what if some really amazing things comes down? I don't know, the world would be better off if Britain didn't exist, for example. I wonder what kind of percentage there would come with that.
Or even Britain would be better off under Sharia law, something like that. You
Something
think,
like that.
You know,
Yes. And it is the extraordinary ignorance. Anyway, it's well worth reading. You might say, well, who knew? You know, this is very. But nevertheless, it's always good to see it put in a modern context. Just one thing I'd add to that is that it just never does fail to astonish me that we're talking about America. I would never have thought that's where it would first, you know, basically be so clearly, you know, in action, and that's in America. You know, I would have thought, like, you know, Marx thought that Russia was going to be the last place there'd be a revolution. You know where he thought it was going to be, don't you? Marx.
Oh, yeah, it's going to be here. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Well,
really?
the industrialized countries. Well, that was that's the whole reason for cultural Marxism, right?
Yeah.
Because of course you had Antonio Gramsci, who realized that the economic model hadn't worked because, of course, it was in feudal countries that communism had succeeded, you know, Russia and China. And he looked at the West and thought, how can we do this? And he realized that you needed to have a cultural revolution, essentially. And then, of course, you get Marcuse and the whole Frankfurt School, where they were sitting down and working on this. The reason it went to America was because of the Second World War, because it was in the Second World War that these Frankfurt academics went over to American universities and sowed the seeds there. And then in '68, you had Roy Duchka, who, of course, coined that phrase, the long march through the institutions, because at the same time you had the more radical communists who thought they could enact change immediately overnight through armed insurrection and terrorism. And he said, no, this is a process of decades. We must take things slowly and have a long march. And the reason that America was ripe ground for all of this was because of its racial makeup, which you didn't have in Europe. We were much more homogenous there. That's why there was no axe to grind, because the working classes of Britain were small c conservative patriots.
Yes, yeah.
And so again, you know, as we all know, increased ethnic diversity leads to a lowering of social trust and more division within societies. And so as this country becomes more ethnically diverse, you can just expect more conflict and more strife and more tension.